Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone who hears it. When the water runs short in the American Southwest, when the great reservoirs of the Colorado River fall too low and the cuts have to come, it is Phoenix, deep in the Arizona desert, that will be forced to ration its water before Los Angeles, on the coast of California, has to give up a single drop of its river supply. This seems backward. Phoenix sits in one of the hottest, driest places in the country, a city carved out of raw desert where survival depends on water more completely than almost anywhere else. Los Angeles sits by the ocean, in a milder climate, a coastal metropolis that seems far less dependent on the distant river. And yet the brutal math of how the water is shared means that Phoenix takes the hit first, and it takes it hard, while Los Angeles remains protected. Understanding why reveals one of the most important and least understood truths about water in the West. The answer has nothing to do with need, or with climate, or with how dry each city is. It has everything to do with a system of priority, an order of who gets cut first that was established long ago and that governs how the pain of a shortage is distributed. In the world of Western water, the fundamental principle is not that the driest or the thirstiest gets protected. It is that the water is allocated according to a hierarchy of rights, a ranking that determines whose supply is secure and whose is vulnerable when the water runs short. And in that hierarchy, through a combination of history and hard bargaining, Phoenix and the water it draws from the Colorado ended up junior, while Los Angeles and California ended up with a more senior claim. When the cuts come, they follow the hierarchy, falling first on the junior rights and only later, if ever, on the senior ones. That is the brutal math, and it is why Phoenix rations first. To understand how this came to be, you have to understand the peculiar position of Arizona in the sharing of the Colorado River. Much of Arizona's growth, including the great metropolitan area of Phoenix, lies far from the river itself, in a region that could only be reached by the water through an enormous and expensive system of canals and pumps built to carry the river across the desert. This great project was essential to Phoenix's future, the artery that would deliver the Colorado's water to the desert city and let it grow. But building it required the support of the federal government, and securing that support required Arizona to make a fateful concession. To win agreement for the project and to overcome the objections of California, Arizona accepted that the water delivered by its great project would hold a junior priority, that in times of shortage it would be cut before California's supply. This was the price of getting the project built, and it planted the seed of the situation we see today. For a long time, that junior position did not matter, because the river seemed to provide enough for everyone, and the shortages that would trigger the cuts never came. Phoenix grew explosively on the water the project delivered, its population swelling, its suburbs spreading across the desert, its economy booming, all on the strength of a water supply that carried a hidden vulnerability. The junior priority was an abstraction, a clause that sat unused while the water flowed freely, and few people thought much about what it would mean if the shortages ever arrived. But the shortages have now arrived. The Colorado River has fallen into a deep crisis. Its flows reduced by a long drought and by the warming climate, its reservoirs drained toward dangerous lows. And as the cuts have become necessary, the junior position that Arizona accepted decades ago has come back to haunt it, placing Phoenix's project water first in line for the reductions. This is the heart of the brutal math. When the shortage forces the system to cut water, the cuts do not fall evenly, and they do not fall on the basis of who needs the water most. They fall according to the priority hierarchy, first on the junior rights, and the water that Phoenix draws from the great project holds one of the most junior positions in the entire system. So when the reductions come, Phoenix's supply is among the very first to be slashed, cut deeply and early, while California's more senior claim is protected. Los Angeles, drawing on California's senior rights, sits higher in the hierarchy, shielded from the cuts that fall on Arizona. The result is the counterintuitive reality that the desert city, in the hotter and drier place, rations before the coastal city, not because it needs the water less, but because it ranks lower in the order of priority. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how brutal this math really is, because it produces an outcome that feels deeply unfair. Phoenix is not a city that can easily do without water. It is one of the hottest major cities in the country, a place where water is not a luxury, but a lifeline, where the summer heat makes water essential for survival. And yet, it is precisely this city that must ration first, that must absorb the deepest cuts, while Los Angeles, in its milder coastal climate, keeps its river water intact. The system does not care about the heat, or the need, or the vulnerability of the desert city. It cares only about the priority, the ranking established long ago, and that ranking dictates that Phoenix suffers first. This is the harsh logic of Western water, a logic in which the order of rights, not the depth of need, determines who bears the pain. But the math has another layer, one that makes Phoenix's position even more precarious. And that is the question of what alternatives each city has when its river water is cut. Los Angeles and the broader region of Southern California, while heavily dependent on the Colorado, are not dependent on it alone. California draws water from other sources as well, from other rivers and systems within the state, giving it a more diversified supply and more options when one source runs short. Los Angeles is also a coastal city with access to the ocean, which opens possibilities for producing fresh water from seawater, an expensive but available alternative that inland cities do not have. This diversity of supply gives Los Angeles a resilience that Phoenix lacks, additional sources to draw upon when the river water is reduced, cushioning the blow of any cut. Phoenix, by contrast, is far more dependent on the Colorado and on a narrower range of sources. The desert city does not sit by the ocean, cannot easily turn to the sea for water, and has fewer alternative rivers and systems to draw upon. Its great vulnerability is that so much of its supply comes from the very source that is being cut, and that its options for replacing that water are more limited. There is one crucial alternative that Arizona and Phoenix do have, which is groundwater, the water stored beneath the ground that can be pumped up to supplement or replace the river supply. This groundwater is a vital cushion, a reserve that Phoenix can draw upon when its river water is cut, and it is part of what makes the situation survivable. But groundwater is not a limitless or a permanent solution, because it too can be depleted if it is pumped faster than it is replenished, and relying too heavily on it carries its own long-term dangers. This is the deeper brutality of the math. Not only does Phoenix rank lower in the priority hierarchy so that its river water is cut first, but it also has fewer alternatives to fall back on, making each cut more painful and harder to absorb. Los Angeles, protected by its senior rights and cushioned by its diverse supply, can weather the shortage with far less disruption, while Phoenix, exposed by its junior rights and constrained by its limited alternatives, faces the prospect of real rationing, of genuine limits on its water use, even as it endures the brutal desert heat. The combination of a junior priority and a narrower range of sources places Phoenix in a doubly vulnerable position, first in line for the cuts and least able to make up the difference. It helps to understand how the cuts actually unfold, because they do not arrive all at once but in stages, tied to the level of the great reservoirs. As the reservoirs fall past certain marks, the system moves into deeper and deeper levels of shortage, and at each level, the reductions grow larger. And at every stage, the junior users are the ones who absorb the reductions. So that Phoenix's project water is cut in the earliest stages, while the more senior users are not touched until the situation grows far more dire. This tiered structure means that Phoenix begins to feel the pain while the reservoirs are still well above their most catastrophic lows, taking cuts at levels that leave California's senior supply untouched. In effect, Phoenix is the shock absorber of the entire system, the first to give when the pressure rises. It is a role the desert city did not choose so much as inherit from the bargains of the past, and it means that Phoenix experiences the shortage as a present reality long before the crisis reaches the point where the protected users would have to share the burden. Consider, too, what rationing actually means for a place like Phoenix, because it is not an abstraction, but a real constraint on life in the desert. As the cuts deepen, the water available to the city is reduced, and that reduction must be managed through some combination of drawing on reserves, tapping groundwater, conserving, and, if necessary, limiting use. The earliest and heaviest cuts tend to fall on agriculture, on the farms that use the project water to grow crops, forcing them to fallow land. But as the cuts deepen, the pressure reaches further, threatening the water that supports the growth of the cities themselves, constraining the ability of the desert metropolis to keep expanding as it has for decades. Rationing, in its fuller sense, means a region learning to live within tighter and tighter limits on its most essential resource, and for Phoenix, first in line for the cuts, that reckoning arrives sooner than for almost anywhere else. Now, it is important to be clear about what this does and does not mean, because the situation, while serious, is not a simple story of Phoenix running dry while Los Angeles thrives untouched. Phoenix and Arizona have been aware of their vulnerability for a long time, and they have taken significant steps to prepare for it, to manage their water carefully, to build up reserves, and to plan for the cuts. Arizona has a sophisticated system for managing its groundwater and has stored water underground for use in times of shortage, giving it a buffer against the reductions. The cities of the region have worked to use their water efficiently, to conserve, and to prepare for a future of less. So while Phoenix does face the cuts first, it is not helpless. And its careful planning may allow it to absorb the early reductions without the kind of catastrophic rationing that the raw priority hierarchy might suggest. The brutal math is real, but it is met by real preparation. Still, the fundamental asymmetry remains, and it shapes the future of both cities in profound ways. Phoenix must live with the knowledge that its river water is first in line for the cuts, that as the shortage deepens, it will face reductions before its coastal neighbor, that its growth and its future are constrained by a vulnerability written into the priority system decades ago. This shapes how Phoenix must plan, forcing it to invest heavily in alternatives and reserves and conservation. To prepare for a future in which its most important water source may be sharply curtailed. Los Angeles, protected by its senior rights, enjoys a greater security, at least with respect to its Colorado River supply, though it faces its own water challenges from its other sources. The asymmetry between the two cities, one first in line for the cuts and one shielded, is a defining feature of the water landscape of the Southwest, and it will shape the trajectories of both cities as the crisis unfolds. There is a profound lesson in all of this about how the burdens of scarcity are distributed and about the difference between need and entitlement. In a purely rational or humane system, one might expect the water to be protected first for the places that need it most, for the hottest and driest cities where water is most essential to survival. But that is not how the system works. It works on the basis of established rights, of a priority hierarchy set long ago through history and negotiation, and that hierarchy can produce outcomes that seem to defy common sense, like a desert city rationing before a coastal one. The brutal math of Phoenix and Los Angeles is a stark illustration of how the allocation of a scarce and vital resource can be governed not by need, but by the accidents of history and the outcomes of old bargains, producing a distribution of pain that has little to do with who suffers most from the loss. This raises deep questions of fairness that the region is only beginning to grapple with. Is it right that Phoenix, in its brutal desert heat, should ration before Los Angeles in its mild coastal climate simply because of a priority order set decades ago? Should the system be reformed to account for need, for climate, for the vulnerability of different places, rather than relying solely on the old hierarchy of rights? These are difficult questions because the priority system, for all its harsh outcomes, provides a clear and predictable rule for sharing the water, and abandoning it in favor of some judgment about need would open a whole new realm of conflict and uncertainty. Yet, as the outcomes of the system become more painful, as the brutal math forces a desert city to ration first, the pressure to reconsider the fairness of the whole arrangement is likely to grow. The tension between the predictability of the established rights and the apparent injustice of their outcomes is one of the central dilemmas of Western water in an age of scarcity. The situation of Phoenix and Los Angeles is also a preview of the kinds of conflicts and hard choices that lie ahead as the crisis of the Colorado deepens. The brutal math that puts Phoenix first in line is not unique to these two cities, but reflects a broader system in which the pain of the shortage is distributed according to priority, producing winners and losers, protected parties and vulnerable ones. As the water grows scarcer, these asymmetries will become more consequential, the differences between senior and junior rights more decisive, the outcomes more contested. The cities and states and users who find themselves first in line for the cuts will feel the injustice of their position and may push back. while those protected by senior rights will defend their advantages. The brutal math of Phoenix and Los Angeles is a small window into a much larger struggle, a struggle over how the diminishing water of the West will be shared, and who will bear the burden of the growing scarcity. In the end, the reason Phoenix will ration before Los Angeles comes down to a system that most people never think about, a hierarchy of water rights established long ago that determines whose supply is secure and whose is vulnerable. It is not about need, not about heat, not about how dry each city is, but about priority, about the order of who gets cut first, and Phoenix, through the bargains of the past, ended up junior to California. Combined with its more limited alternatives, this junior position places the desert city first in line for the pain, forcing it to confront rationing while its neighbor remains protected. The brutal math is harsh, and it feels unfair, but it is the logic that governs the water of the West. And understanding it is essential to understanding the crisis that is unfolding across the region. Phoenix has prepared, and it will fight to soften the blow, but the fundamental reality remains. When the water runs short, the desert city bears the cuts first, and that is a truth written into the very foundations of how the West shares its most precious resource. So the next time you hear about the water crisis in the Southwest and wonder which cities are most at risk, remember the brutal math. It is not always the driest or the thirstiest that suffers first. It is the one that ranks lowest in the hierarchy of rights, the one whose claim is junior, the one that made the concessions in the bargains of the past. And in the contest between Phoenix and Los Angeles, that city is Phoenix, the desert metropolis that will ration before the coastal giant, not because it needs the water less, but because the math of Western water, indifferent to need, has placed it first in line for the pain. It is a sobering illustration of how the rules we make can outlast the circumstances that produce them, and how the distribution of a vital resource can come to depend not on justice or need,